Hello and welcome back. In this next episode of 5-Minute Photoshop, we're going to take a look at how we make selections and turn them into masks on adjustment layers in Photoshop. And this is the next most important tool that you need to learn in order to get the best out of this program. So let's jump in and take a look. So here we are back in Photoshop using a similar image or the same image we've used previously, and this is a good example to use for making selections and using examples of all the tools available. And we've got two different ways we can make selections. We can go to the select menu and we can select using some various options here. We can select using the color range, an area in focus. We can ideally select the subject, although what that subject is in this particular photograph is a little bit open. We can select the sky, which is a great way to work often when we want to make a change to the sky. And so we've got those options available to us. We also have the tools down the left-hand toolbar, and if we click and hold on this little menu item, we've got three different tools here, which would be the ones you'd use most of the time. Firstly, we've got the object selection tool, then we have the quick selection tool, which is probably the one that's most useful, and then the magic wand tool. So with those, and we also have further down, way down here, we've got the quick mask tool, which means that if we want to paint on a layer, we can do that with that tool, and we'll demonstrate that shortly. So let's go back to how we could make selections. So looking firstly at the selection tools from the main toolbar, we can choose from one of these. Now, one of the most obvious things you do in most landscape photographs is try and darken the sky, because often the sky is too bright for the rest of the landscape. And so we have a tool here to select the sky, and in most cases when we use any of these tools, it will do a pretty good job but not a perfect job. And so once we've made a selection, we'd need to have a look at that, and we can see these little marching ants, we call them, along the edges where the selection has been made. And we can see here where it's selected some blue glass here that's not part of the sky, and in some other areas it's selected things that are not really meant to be part of the selection, but also missed an area of sky here. So in nearly all cases, when you use one of these tools, you're going to need to add to that or modify it to get a good enough selection to make an adjustment. So how do we do that? Well, we've used the tools from the select menu, and what we're going to do now is come down to our toolbar and pick one of these selection tools, and the most obvious one is the quick selection tool. And what we've got here is we've got areas selected that shouldn't be selected and areas not selected that should be selected. And with this particular tool, we have three options. We have make a new selection, which would throw away everything that's been done so far, or we can add to an existing selection, or we can subtract from an existing selection. So in this case, let's firstly use the tool for subtracting from an existing selection. And having done that, what we have next to it is a size of the actual brush that's used to make the measurements. And what we need to do is we need to use as small a tool as possible to keep the selection range very narrow. If we end up making a very large selection tool, it's going to sample a lot more colors, and then you're going to have trouble finding an actual selection that's going to work. So what I like to do is keep that selection size below 10, and we can do it here, and we can use our square bracket keys to make it larger or smaller. So I've got the subtract from selection tool. I'm just going to move the image over here. All I do is click and hold with my left mouse button and go over the areas. Now you'll see here I've gone to the edge of the building, and it's momentarily gone outside that. Once I let go, that selection will now refine that edge. So it's usually a pretty simple matter of going along where these edges have been included and just highlighting them, and then let the software find those edges again. It will do a pretty good job. It's not going to pick up all of those areas down in here, but we can see here there's a bit of sky that's been missed. So we would go to the plus tool and go in and tidy that up there. And for instance, and again even more, there's some other areas that shouldn't be included. And the software has a problem where there's very little contrast between areas of color or luminosity. So it's not perfect, but it does a pretty good job in most cases. Now I'm not going to sit here and go through all of these areas and refine them, because that will be very boring. Suffice it to say that using the refinement tools, we can then pick up extra areas and massage this to the point where we've got a selection that's workable. And let's just assume that what I've done now is going to be okay. We've got a selection of the sky. So what do I want to do? I want to darken that sky down. The best way to do that is to use a curves layer. So selection is active. I go to my adjustment layer panel, pick a curves layer. It creates the curves adjustment layer and applies that selection as a mask to the layer. Now this is one I created earlier, so I'll just delete that. Here we have the adjustment. No adjustment has been made so far, and here's the mask. So what I would normally do would be to just maybe darken that sky down a little bit. Without going too stupid, we can just add a little bit of, maybe a little bit of contrast there, brighten those clouds up and darken the sky. Now, because it's not an absolutely perfect selection, the edges are not going to be perfect, but for most cases, this isn't going to be an issue. Okay, so we've made our adjustment layer, we've got a mask, and we've applied selectively. What happens if you suddenly decide, oh, there's an area that I didn't refine earlier, what can I do? Well, we've got a couple of different ways we can fix things. If we click on the mask area to select it, you'll see a white box appears around it. If I hold down the Alt key and then click on that again, it will overlay the mask over the image, so we get a very clear picture of what's been included and what's not included, and we'll see that there's a few areas that aren't quite right. But what we can do is that we now have a mask overlaid over our image. We could actually take our paintbrush tool, which is this tool, and paint with either black or white over areas to include them or remove them. So let's just say there's a few areas here that I want to remove. I'm just going to use the black brush. This is just a simple example. I'll push it up to 100% opacity, and I'm going to make the brush a bit smaller, and so we'll zoom in, and you'll see if I brush over parts of the building, being very careful not to go over the edges, I can then remove some of those selections. And what the sky selection does is it often wraps a little bit of the sky around the edges of the building, because typically we're going to have a little bit of feathering around that mask. So, oops, I've gone too far. Okay, how do I fix that? Well, I could go back and change the brush to white and try and paint that back out, but actually that's going to be pretty tricky. So what I'm going to do is just go to Edit and undo my last use of that tool and redo that. So here's another way that we can modify the mask, and while we're here, we have the mask selected, we have it overlaid over the image. We also have a couple of other options here in the properties panel. We can feather that mask even more, and if I slide that up quite a long way, you'll see now that I get a very soft edge. That's probably not appropriate here, but we can also change the density so that, for instance, with a mask being black, none of the effects are going to apply to the area in black, but by reducing the density of this mask, I can partially apply those adjustments to that part of the image. In this case, I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to change it. I'll go back to the image by going to the mask, holding down Alt and clicking again on that to take it off the overlay, and we can see that we've got an adjustment. So there's just a couple of quick ways that we can make a selection using one of these tools. In this case, we use the Select Sky, but there are other tools we'll demonstrate in future videos. But using the Select tools and then modifying them with either the brush or the Quick Selection tool, we can make a very good selection and make big improvements to an image very quickly. Now we'll cover many more aspects of making selections and applying them as masks in future videos, but one final step, looking at this brief example we used, we have our selection, we have our density and our feather slider. If we wanted to go back in and rethink that whole mask, we could come back here and click on the select and mask option, and that will take us back into that tool that we looked at a little earlier. And with that tool we can do a few more things. So there are a number of ways we can make a selection. We can apply it as a mask to an adjustment layer, and then that gets us started on using the wonderful tools within Photoshop that allow us to make selective adjustments to our images. So in future videos we'll cover more aspects of this, but for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.